To remove the ignition coil, begin by disconnecting the ignition wiring harness from the ignition coil. Unbolt the ignition coil from the rocker lever cover and gently pull up on the ignition coil. Make sure there is enough clearance above the top of the coil so that it will not be damaged when it detaches from the plug and pops up. If the coil can't be removed by gently pulling, prying the coil up may be necessary. Lift the coil up and place an 18-inch pry bar under the coil and gently pry up. To perform the initial test, begin by connecting the ignition harness to the ignition coil. It is very important that the ignition coil connectors should be connected prior to running the engine. It is important not to allow them to arc to ground, as damage to the ICM can occur. 400-volt potential at the connector could arc to ground if the connector is not connected. Insert the bare thread of the ignition coil tester into the end of the ignition coil. Attach the alligator clip to a suitable ground. The alligator clip must be grounded for the tool to function. If the tool is not grounded, arcing can result from the high voltage being applied to the alligator clip. Route the ignition coil tester so that it does not touch any metallic surface on the engine, because arcing can occur. Do not attempt to adjust the ignition coil tester. It is preset and not adjustable. An attempt to adjust can result in tool damage. The coils must be held vertically when testing, or the coil will be damaged, and should not be held in a vertical position by holding the coil when testing. Gravity draws the insulating oil inside the coil downward. Improper coating of oil while testing, caused by holding the coil at an incorrect angle, will damage the coil. The coil should be held at a similar angle to the orientation inside the engine. Holding the connector coil by the ignition harness is acceptable. Crank the engine or start the engine and let it idle. Observe the spark gap inside the observation window. If a steady spark is observed, the ignition coil is acceptable. If no spark is observed, replace the ignition coil and test again. Stop the engine. Remove the ignition coil tester from the ignition coil and disconnect the alligator clip. To continue the initial testing of the remaining coils, follow the installation steps shown in the installation section and repeat these steps for the remaining ignition coils. To perform the ignition coil resistance check, perform the following steps. Measure the secondary winding resistance to check for open circuits. Connect the digital multimeter leads between pin C in the 4-pin coil connector and the spark plug connection. The resistance measured must be less than 20 k ohms. If the resistance is not less than 20 k ohms, remove the coil extension and test the coil again. If the resistance is not less than 20 k ohms, replace the entire coil. If the resistance is now less than 20 k ohms, replace only the coil extension. Replace the ignition coil as necessary. Install the mounting hardware. Tighten the cap screws to specification. Refer to QuickServe Online for specifications. Over-tightening the cap screws or using an impact wrench will damage the threaded inserts in the rocker lever cover and could also damage the rocker lever cover. Connect the ignition wiring harness to the ignition coil. If there is difficulty installing the ignition coil onto the spark plug, Apply a very light film of dielectric grease on the outside ribs of the coil extension. This will help the coil pass through the spark plug adapter tube.